They say fire purifies everything it touches. But in the summer of 1842, on Rosefield Plantation, in the heart of Alabama, fire became something else entirely. It became judgment, vengeance, and the only language a woman had left to speak her truth. Hello, my friends. This is Malik Jefferson, narrator of Slave's Revenge, and today you will hear a story that will touch every part of your heart. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's always exciting to know how far our stories reach. Get ready, because the excitement begins now. The air that night hung thick as molasses, pressing down on the cotton fields like God's own hand holding the earth still. Not a breath of wind moved through the magnolia. Even the cicadas had gone silent, as if they knew something terrible was coming, something that would split the world of Rosefield Plantation into before and after. Betsy stood in the shadows near the big house, her calloused hands gripping the rough fabric of her work dress. 34 years old, with eyes that had seen more horror than most could survive. She had learned long ago that silence was armor, that a lowered gaze could be a shield, that invisibility was sometimes the only power a slave woman possessed. But tonight, invisibility would serve a different purpose. The smokehouse sat at the edge of the quarters, a squat building made of thick oak planks, weathered gray by years of smoke and rain. During the day, it was where they cured the master's pork and beef, where the smell of hickory and salt filled the air. But the slaves of Rosefield knew it for what it truly was, a chamber of suffering, a place where Overseer Harlan took women when he wanted privacy for his particular brand of cruelty. Betsy had been taken there herself, more times than she could count, more times than she could bear to remember fully. Her mind had learned to fracture during those hours, to split itself into pieces, so that some part of her could survive untouched, floating somewhere above the smoke, stained rafters while her body endured below. But memory is a stubborn thing. It doesn't stay buried. It rises like smoke, seeping through every crack, filling every empty space, until there's nowhere left to hide from what was done to you. She had spent 5 years waiting for this night. 5 years of watching, learning Harlan's patterns, understanding his weaknesses. 5 years of swallowing her rage like bitter medicine, letting it ferment inside her chest until it became something harder than hate. It became purpose. The door to the overseer's quarters opened, spilling yellow lamplight across the dirt yard. Harlan emerged, adjusting his belt, his massive frame silhouetted against the light. He was a bull of a man 6 feet tall, and thick with muscle gone soft around the middle, his face permanently red from too much whiskey and too much sun. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they never showed anything that could be mistaken for human compassion. Betsy stepped forward into the moonlight, just enough to be seen. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained perfectly calm, perfectly submissive. She had practiced this expression for so long, it had become a mask she could wear without thinking. "Mr. Harlan, sir," she called out, her voice pitched with just the right amount of urgency and fear. "I'm real sorry to bother you this late, but there's trouble in the smokehouse." Harlan turned, squinting into the darkness. When he recognized her, a slow smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, who had never faced consequences for taking what wasn't his. "Betsy," he said, her name drawn out like a threat. "What kind of trouble?" She wrung her hands, the picture of a nervous slave worried about punishment. "The meat, sir. Some of it's gone bad. The smell is something terrible. I only noticed because I was passing by on my way from the kitchen house. If Master Thornton finds out in the morning, he'll have all our hides." This was the crucial moment. Harlan was lazy and cruel, but he wasn't entirely stupid. If she pushed too hard, he might suspect. If she didn't push hard enough, he might decide to wait until morning. She let her voice crack just slightly. He'll blame you, sir. Say you should have checked it yourself. That did it. Harlan's face darkened at the suggestion that anyone might question his competence. He stepped down from the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. Show me, he commanded. Betsy lowered her eyes and turned toward the smokehouse, moving slowly enough that he would follow, but not so slowly that he'd grow impatient. Behind them, the plantation slept. The big house was dark, except for one window on the second floor, where Master Thornton's young wife sometimes sat up reading. The slave quarters were silent. Every family locked behind their thin wooden doors, knowing better than to venture out after dark when Harlan was prowling. Only old Moses, who slept in the barn with the horses, might have seen them walking toward the smokehouse, but Moses was nearly blind, and even if he saw, he would say nothing. The slaves of Rosefield had learned long ago that survival meant seeing nothing, hearing nothing, knowing nothing. The smokehouse door stood slightly ajar, exactly as Betsy had left it an hour earlier. The interior was pitch black, except for the faint red glow of coals in the fire pit that provided the smoke for curing meat. The smell was overwhelming, not of spoiled meat, but of the thick, acrid smoke that never quite left the building, that had soaked into every board and beam. Betsy pulled the door wider and stepped aside, gesturing for Harlan to enter first. For a moment he hesitated, some animal instinct perhaps warning him of danger. But then his pride overruled his caution, and he stepped inside. I don't smell nothing wrong, he said, moving deeper into the darkness. Where's this spoiled? Betsy didn't wait for him to finish. She threw her whole weight against the heavy oak door, slamming it shut with a sound like thunder. Her hands, shaking now with adrenaline and 5 years of accumulated rage, fumbled for the iron bolt. She heard Harlan roar, heard his body crash against the door from the inside, but the bolt slid home with a satisfying click before he could reach it. What the hell, Betsy? Open this door. His fists pounded against the oak, making the whole structure shudder. Open it right now, or I swear to God. Swear to God what? Betsy asked, her voice suddenly steady, all pretense of fear gone. What you gonna do that you ain't already done? She moved to the side of the building where ventilation slits had been cut to allow smoke to escape. Through them, she could see Harlan's shadow moving frantically, searching for another way out. There wasn't one. The smokehouse had been built like a fortress, specifically to protect the master's valuable meat from thieves. Now it would serve a different purpose. Betsy reached down to where she had prepared her materials earlier that evening, a bucket of fresh coals from the kitchen fire, burning hot and red. With steady hands that no longer trembled, she began pushing them through the ventilation slits, one after another, feeding them into the fire pit inside. What are you doing? Harlan's voice had changed now, losing some of its certainty. Betsy, this ain't funny. Let me out. She didn't answer. She simply kept feeding coals through the slits, watching as the fire pit inside began to glow brighter, as smoke started pouring from the building in thick gray columns. The temperature inside would be rising quickly now. The smoke would be getting thicker, harder to breathe. Betsy knew this intimately. She had been locked in this very building during winter, when Harlan decided her attitude needed correcting, left for hours with nothing but smoke to breathe and the cold to battle. Now it was his turn to understand that particular hell. Please. Harlan's voice cracked. She heard him coughing now, the smoke starting to overwhelm him. I'll give you anything. Money, your freedom papers. Please, just let me out. Betsy paused, one coal held in her bare hand, not even feeling the burn. Freedom papers. As if he had any authority to grant such a thing. As if 5 words could undo 5 years of violation and humiliation. She pushed the coal through the slit and watched it fall. "You remember Sarah?" she asked quietly, speaking to the building rather than to the man inside. "She was 15 when you started taking her to the smokehouse. She hung herself in the barn 2 months later. More coals, more smoke. You remember Dina? She stopped talking after you were done with her. Still ain't said a word in 3 years." The coffin inside had become constant now, punctuated by choking gasps. "You remember me, Mr. Harlan? All those times you said I should be grateful, that I should smile, that it was my Christian duty to submit." The pounding on the door had weakened. Through the ventilation slits, she could see him on his knees now, crawling toward the door, trying to find breathable air in a room that had none left. Betsy added the last of the coals. The fire pit inside was blazing now, the heat so intense that the oak planks themselves had begun to smolder. Soon the whole structure would be burning from the inside out. She stepped back, watching as smoke poured from every crack and seam. Inside, the sounds had changed. Less coughing now, more of a wet, choking wheeze. Then, gradually, silence. The night air still hung heavy and still. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, but no rain came. Just the smoke rising straight up into the darkness, like an offering. Like a prayer made of fire and judgment. Betsy stood there for a long time watching the smokehouse burn. She thought about Sarah, about Dinah, about all the women whose names she knew and those she didn't. She thought about her own daughter, sold away to a plantation in Mississippi when she was just 7 years old. She thought about the God that the master's family prayed to every Sunday, the one who supposedly saw everything and would deliver justice in the afterlife. She was tired of waiting for the afterlife. When the first flames finally broke through the roof, painting the night orange and red, Betsy turned away. She walked calmly to her cabin, removed her headscarf, and nailed it to the doorpost with a single horseshoe nail. Then she walked into the woods behind the quarters, following a path only the slaves knew, heading north toward a hope she might not live to see, but would die trying to reach. Behind her, the smokehouse burned like a beacon. By the time anyone woke to raise the alarm, by the time they brought water from the well and formed bucket chains, there would be nothing left but ash and bones and the iron tools that even fire couldn't destroy. The sun rose on a changed world. Master Thornton stood in his nightshirt before the smoking ruins, his face gray with shock. The slaves gathered in a silent semicircle, their faces carefully blank, revealing nothing. When the constable arrived from town and began his investigation, not a single person claimed to have seen or heard anything unusual. But in the quarters that night, and in quarters across 3 counties, people whispered a name with something like awe. Betsy, the woman who turned fire into freedom, who made a tool of her oppression into a weapon of her deliverance. And in smokehouses across Alabama, overseers began to feel, perhaps for the first time, the cold touch of fear. The morning after the fire, Rosefield Plantation woke to a silence more complete than any Sunday church service had ever commanded. It was the silence of held breath, of hearts beating too fast, of minds struggling to process what smoke and ash had revealed in the gray light of dawn. Constable William Bradford arrived on horseback just after breakfast, his face already slick with sweat despite the early hour. He was a thin man with a perpetual stoop, as if the weight of enforcing the law in Wilcox County had permanently bent his spine. Behind him rode 3 men from town, merchants and landowners who served as the volunteer patrol when needed. Master Richard Thornton met them in the yard, still wearing the same nightshirt he'd thrown on when the screams of fire had shattered his sleep. His wife, Eleanor, remained in the house, her face pressed to the upstairs window, one pale hand gripping the curtain, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The ruins of the smokehouse still smoldered, sending up thin wisps of smoke that drifted lazily in the morning heat. The structure had collapsed in on itself, leaving only the stone foundation and the twisted remains of metal hooks and chains that had hung from the rafters. In the center of it all, barely recognizable as human, lay what remained of Overseer Harlan. "Jesus Christ," Bradford muttered, approaching the ruins carefully. The heat still radiated from the blackened wood, forcing him to keep his distance. How long was it burning before anyone noticed? Thornton's hands shook as he gestured vaguely. "I don't know. 2 hours, 3. My wife woke me when she smelled the smoke. By the time we got people organized with buckets, it was already." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Bradford circled the ruins slowly, his boots crunching on charred debris. The other men stayed mounted, their horses nervous from the smell of death and burnt flesh. One of them, a plantation owner named Silas Cord, leaned forward in his saddle. "This wasn't no accident," Cord said flatly. "Look at the door." They all turned to where he was pointing. The door had fallen inward during the collapse, but the heavy iron bolt was still visible, clearly drawn shut from the outside. The implication hung in the air, like the smoke itself. He was locked in, Bradford said quietly. Someone locked him in and let him burn. Thornton's face went from gray to white. "That's not possible. My people wouldn't. They know what would happen if—" "Your people." Cord interrupted, his voice sharp. "Your slaves. You mean one of your slaves murdered your overseer?" "Richard. Burned him alive. And you're standing here telling me it's not possible." Bradford held up a hand to forestall further argument. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. First thing we need to do is account for everyone. Mr. Thornton, I need you to call all your slaves to assembly. Every single one. We'll take a count and see who's missing." The bell rang across Rosefield Plantation, its iron voice carrying to the furthest fields. Within 30 minutes, 63 slaves stood in ragged lines before the big house. Men, women, and children, their faces carefully expressionless. They had learned long ago to become invisible when white men gathered to dispense justice. Old Jeremiah, who served as the senior field hand, counted them off while Bradford took notes. When they reached the end, Thornton's face had gone from white to red. "Did you know the Seminole tribe of Florida became famous for harboring escaped slaves and forming alliances with them? These freedom seekers, known as Black Seminoles or Seminole Maroons, lived in separate villages, but fought alongside the Seminoles against U.S. forces during the Seminole Wars, 1817 to 1858. The alliance was so strong that many Black Seminoles spoke the Seminole language and adopted their customs. This unique relationship created one of the largest and most successful communities of freed slaves in North America before the Civil War, with some eventually relocating to Mexico and the Bahamas to maintain their freedom. "Betsy's missing," he said, his voice tight. "Betsy Johnson. She works in the kitchen house." Bradford wrote the name carefully. "Describe her." 34 years old, about 5'6", strong woman, good worker." Thornton paused, his jaw working. Harlan had some trouble with her in the past. She had a rebellious streak. Several of the slaves shifted their feet, but no one spoke. Bradford noticed this and turned to face them directly. "Anyone here see Betsy last night? Anyone know where she might have gone?" The silence stretched out like taffy. Children pressed closer to their mothers. Men studied the dirt at their feet. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. Finally, old Moses stepped forward slightly. He was ancient, his face a map of wrinkles, his eyes clouded with cataracts. "I might have seen something," he said slowly, his voice wavering with age. "My eyes ain't what they used to be, but I was in the barn last night, tending to Master's mare what was looking to foal." "What did you see?" Bradford demanded. Moses seemed to struggle with the memory. "I saw Mr. Harlan walking toward the smokehouse. And I think, though I can't be certain, mind you, I think someone was walking ahead of him. Could have been Betsy. Could have been anyone. Like I said, my eyes ain't good no more." "What time was this?" "Late. After the moon was high, maybe midnight, maybe later." Bradford turned back to Thornton. "Did anyone else see anything? Anyone hear anything?" More silence. Then a young woman named Clara, who worked in the big house, raised her hand tentatively. "I was in the kitchen late, cleaning up from supper. I heard." She faltered, fear evident in every line of her body. "Go on," Bradford said, not unkindly. "You won't be punished for telling the truth." Clara's eyes flicked to the other slaves, seeking permission, or perhaps forgiveness, for what she was about to say. "I heard voices, a man and a woman. The man sounded angry. The woman, she was crying. Or maybe laughing. I couldn't tell which." "Did you recognize the voices?" "No, sir. I just heard them through the window. Then I didn't hear nothing more, so I finished my work and went to my cabin." Cord leaned down from his horse. "Constable, we're wasting time. It's clear what happened here. The woman lured Harlan into the smokehouse, locked the door, and set the fire. Every minute we stand here talking, she's getting further away. We need to organize a search party. Get the dogs." Bradford nodded slowly. "You're probably right, but I want to examine the scene more carefully first. Mr. Thornton, can you have some of your men carefully go through the ruins? I want to know exactly what happened in there." While several slaves were put to work, sifting through the ashes under Bradford's supervision, the constable walked the perimeter of the burned building. He found Betsy's headscarf nailed to the doorpost of her cabin. The fabric faded and worn, but deliberately placed. It struck him as odd. If she was running, why take the time to leave such an obvious sign? Inside the cabin, he found even less. Betsy had owned almost nothing, as was common for slaves: a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks, a single change of clothes, a wooden cup and bowl. But what caught his attention was what wasn't there. No food stored away for a journey, no missing shoes or extra clothing. Either she'd planned to travel light, or this had been a spontaneous decision. On the wall, carved crudely into the wood with something sharp, were several marks. Bradford couldn't tell if they were words or simply scratches. He made a note to have someone who could read better examine them later. By noon, the examination of the smokehouse ruins was complete. The slaves working under Bradford's direction had found something that made the constable's blood run coldy. Additional accelerant. Someone had poured what smelled like lamp oil through the ventilation slits. This hadn't been just about locking Harlan inside. This had been about ensuring he couldn't escape. That the fire would burn hot enough and fast enough to kill him. This was planned, Bradford told Thornton and the other men who had gathered. She thought about this, prepared for it. That makes it premeditated murder, not a crime of passion. Cord spat into the dirt. What difference does it make? She killed a white man. She burned him alive. There's only one punishment for that. If we catch her, Bradford said. She's got a good 12-hour head start, maybe more. Could be anywhere by now. Then we better stop talking and start tracking, Cord replied. I'll ride back to town and get the dogs and as many men as I can round up. We'll search every inch of this county if we have to. As Cord galloped off, Bradford turned back to the assembled slaves. Most had been dismissed back to their work. The cotton wouldn't pick itself, and Thornton couldn't afford to lose a full day of labor. But he'd kept a handful of the older ones, the ones who might know something useful. "I need to understand something," he said, addressing them collectively. What kind of woman was Betsy? Was she the type to plan something like this? The slaves exchanged glances. Finally, an old woman named Ruth spoke up. She was a cook in the big house, had been there for 40 years, and had earned a certain latitude to speak more freely than most. Betsy was quiet. Ruth said carefully, kept to herself mostly, did her work without complaint. But, she hesitated. But what? But she had sadness in her. Deep sadness. The kind that don't never heal, right? Her baby girl was sold away 7 years ago. Just 7 years old. And Master Thornton needed the money, so he sold her down to Mississippi. Betsy ain't been the same since. Bradford wrote this down. Did she have trouble with Overseer Harlan specifically? Another long pause. Then Ruth nodded slowly. Mr. Harlan? He liked to take women to the smokehouse. Said he was punishing them for being lazy or talking back, but everyone knew what really happened in there. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Betsy went there more than most. No, why didn't anyone report this to Master Thornton? Ruth looked at him, as if he'd asked why birds didn't swim. Sir, who would we report it to? Master Thornton gave Mr. Harlan authority over us. And even if he hadn't, she trailed off. But the implication was clear. Masters didn't interfere in such matters. What an overseer did with female slaves was considered his business. Bradford felt a familiar discomfort settling in his stomach. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered this particular complication in his work. The law was clear about murder. A slave who killed a white person faced death, usually by hanging, sometimes by burning if the crime was particularly heinous. But the law was silent on what a white man could do to a slave woman in a locked building. Thank you for your honesty, Ruth, he said finally. You can go back to your work. As the slaves dispersed, Thornton approached Bradford, his face troubled. You're not suggesting that Harlan deserved what happened to him? I'm not suggesting anything, Bradford replied evenly. I'm trying to understand what happened and why. That's my job. Your job is to catch that murderous woman and see that justice is done. Justice, Bradford repeated softly, looking back at the smoking ruins. Yes, sir. Justice. By that evening, 30 men on horseback had gathered at Rosefield Plantation, along with 6 bloodhounds borrowed from plantations across the county. The dogs were set to sniffing Betsy's mattress and the headscarf, and soon they were baying eagerly, pulling at their leashes. The search party headed north, following the dogs into the pine forests that stretched for miles beyond Rosefield. Silas Cord took the lead, his face set with grim determination. Behind him rode plantation owners, merchants, the county sheriff who'd arrived from the courthouse, and even a few young men from town who saw this as an adventure. Bradford rode near the back, his mind troubled. He'd been a lawman for 15 years, had tracked down runaway slaves before, had presided over trials and punishments. But something about this case sat wrong with him. Maybe it was the premeditation, the cold planning that spoke of an intelligence and determination he didn't usually associate with slaves. Maybe it was Ruth's words about what happened in the smokehouse, about Betsy's daughter sold away. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the memory of Harlan's remains, charred beyond recognition, and the thought of what his last minutes must have been like. Locked in darkness and smoke, the heat rising, realizing too late that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. The dogs led them through the forest until full darkness fell, forcing them to make camp. They built fires and posted guards, knowing that Betsy couldn't be far ahead. A woman alone, without food or supplies, in territory she didn't know she couldn't survive more than a few days. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Betsy wasn't alone, and she wasn't heading randomly into the wilderness. She was following a map carved into her memory, by whispered conversations, by coded songs sung in the fields, by the network of secret knowledge that slaves maintained despite every effort to keep them isolated and ignorant. She was following the Underground Railroad, heading toward a safe house 20 miles north, where people who believed that all men were created equal would hide her, feed her, and send her further north toward freedom. As the search party slept fitfully under the stars, Betsy walked through darkness that held no fear for her. She had already faced the worst thing she could imagine and survived it. She had already walked through fire, literally and figuratively. Now she was walking towards something new, something that might break her heart with hope, but at least it would be her own heart beating in her own chest, belonging to no one but herself. The night held its breath, and somewhere in the distance, thunder finally rumbled, bringing with it the promise of rain that would wash away tracks, confuse dogs, and give a desperate woman just a few more hours of head start. Rain came just before dawn, turning the forest floor into mud and drowning the scent trail that had seemed so promising the night before. The bloodhounds circled in confusion, whining and pawing at the ground, unable to pick up Betsy's trail in the downpour. Silas Cord cursed loudly enough to wake the entire camp, kicking at a soggy log in frustration. "We're wasting time," he shouted over the sound of rain hammering through the pine canopy. "Every minute we sit here, she's getting further away." Constable Bradford stood under a makeshift shelter, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "The dogs are useless in this weather. We need to think about where she'd go, not just follow blindly." "She'd go north," said Thomas Whitmore, a young plantation owner from the next county. "They always go north. Think they'll find freedom there." Bradford considered this. "North is a big direction. We need to narrow it down. Where are the nearest way stations on the Underground Railroad?" The men exchanged glances. The Underground Railroad was an open secret in the South. Everyone knew it existed, knew that sympathetic folks in the North helped runaway slaves escape. But the network was shrouded in mystery and code words that changed constantly. "There's rumors of a Quaker family about 20 miles northeast of here," offered Sheriff Daniels, a heavy, set man with tobacco-stained teeth. "The Hendersons. They've never been proven to harbor runaways, but folks have suspected them for years." Cord's face lit up with predatory eagerness. "Then that's where we go. Forget the dogs. We ride straight to the Henderson place and tear it apart if we have to." Bradford held up a hand. "We can't just raid a white family's home without cause. The Hendersons have rights, same as anyone." "Rights?" Cord's voice dripped with contempt. "They're harboring a murderer, a slave who burned a white man alive. That gives us all the cause we need." The argument continued as the rain intensified, soaking through clothing and dampening spirits. Finally, Bradford made a decision. They would split up. Half the party would continue tracking through the forest in case Betsy had gone a different direction, while the other half would ride to the Henderson farm to investigate. Meanwhile, 15 miles to the northeast, Betsy crouched in a root cellar beneath a small farmhouse, listening to the rain pound overhead. She'd reached the Henderson place just before midnight, following landmarks described to her years ago by an old slave named Jacob, who'd tried to run and been caught. Before they hanged him, he'd managed to whisper directions to a few trusted souls, planting seeds of hope even in his final moments. The Hendersons were Quakers. Samuel and Rebecca, both in their 50s, their children grown and moved away. They were quiet people who believed that slavery was a sin against God and that helping souls escape bondage was their Christian duty. Consequences be damned. Rebecca Henderson stood at the top of the cellar stairs now, holding a lamp that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. She descended carefully, bringing with her a basket covered with a cloth. "I've brought food," she said softly. "Bread, cheese, dried apples. There's water in the jug." Betsy had barely eaten in 2 days. She tore into the bread with desperate hunger, tears streaming down her face, not from relief, but from the simple shock of kindness. After so many years of cruelty disguised as Christian duty, to encounter actual Christianity was almost more than she could process. "Thank you," she managed between bites. "Thank you." Rebecca sat on a barrel, watching her eat with sad, understanding eyes. "Samuel says they'll be coming soon. The whole county will be looking for thee by now. We have to move thee quickly. There's another station 30 miles north, near the Tennessee border. Friends there can hide thee for a few days, then move thee further when it's safe. But thee must leave tonight despite the rain. Samuel will take thee in the wagon, hidden under hay." Betsy's hands shook as she drank from the water jug. "Why are you doing this? You could be arrested. Your farm could be seized." Rebecca smiled gently. "There is that of God in every person, including thee. To deny thee thy freedom is to deny God's light. We cannot do that, no matter the cost." Upstairs, Samuel Henderson sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle. He was a tall man, spare and angular, with piercing gray eyes that had seen 70 years of life. Despite his peaceful Quaker beliefs, he kept the rifle loaded and ready. He'd used it 3 times before to defend runaways, and he'd use it again if necessary. The theological contradiction didn't trouble him. God could sort out whether defending the helpless with violence was righteous. Samuel had his own conscience to guide him, and it spoke clearly. A knock at the door brought him to his feet, rifle in hand. Through the window, he could see a lone rider, a man he recognized as William Bradford, the constable from Wilcox County. Samuel's jaw tightened as he set the rifle within easy reach and opened the door. "Constable," he said evenly, "this is unexpected." Bradford stood on the porch, rain dripping from his coat. He was alone. He'd ridden ahead of the main party to scout. Up close, Samuel could see the exhaustion in the man's face and something else. Doubt, perhaps. Or shame. "Mr. Henderson, I apologize for the early hour. I'm looking for a runaway slave named Betsy Johnson. Have you seen any strangers on your property in the last day or so?" Samuel met his eyes steadily. "I see many strangers, Constable. My wife and I believe in hospitality to travelers." "That's not an answer. It's the answer thee will receive." Bradford sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Mr. Henderson, I know about your sympathies. I've known for years and never troubled you because you seemed harmless enough. But this is different. This woman murdered a man. Burned him alive. Whatever you think about slavery, you can't condone murder. Can't I?" Samuel's voice remained calm, but steel underlay it. "If a man kept me in bondage, worked me without wages, raped me when he pleased, sold my children away from me, would I not be justified in defending myself by any means necessary? The law is an ass, Constable. Thee knows it as well as I do." Bradford rubbed his face tiredly. "The law is all we have to keep society from descending into chaos. If everyone just took justice into their own hands." "Everyone," Samuel interrupted. "Or just slaves?" "Because I don't see thee worried about the white men who take justice into their own hands every day, the overseers who whip and rape and kill with impunity. Where's thy law for them?" They stared at each other, the rain falling between them like a curtain. Finally, Bradford spoke more quietly. "I can't just look the other way. There are 30 men behind me who will tear this place apart looking for her. Silas Cord is leading them, and he won't be as gentle as I am. Then thee better leave before they arrive. I have nothing more to say to thee." Bradford stood there a moment longer, his internal struggle visible on his face. Then he nodded slowly and turned back to his horse. "I'll tell them you weren't here," he said without looking back, "that you'd gone to town for supplies. That'll buy you maybe an hour. After that, I can't help you." He rode away into the rain, and Samuel Henderson closed the door, his heart pounding. They had less time than he'd hoped. He descended to the root cellar, where Rebecca was already helping Betsy gather her few belongings. "They're coming," he said simply. "We leave now." Within 10 minutes, Betsy was buried under a load of hay in Samuel's wagon, a small air pocket allowing her to breathe. Rebecca handed Samuel a rifle and a pistol, both loaded. "May God guide thy hands," she said, kissing his weathered cheek. "And thine eyes," he replied, their traditional farewell. The wagon rolled out into the rain, its wheels cutting deep ruts in the muddy road. Samuel drove slowly, deliberately, knowing that hurrying would only draw attention. Behind them, the farm disappeared into the gray morning, Rebecca standing at the window, watching until they were out of sight. She didn't have long to wait. Less than 30 minutes after Samuel left, the sound of many horses approached. Rebecca composed her face into a pleasant expression and opened the door before they could knock. Silas Cord sat his horse in the yard, rain streaming off his hat. Behind him 24 armed men waited, their faces hard with purpose and frustration. "Mrs. Henderson," Cord said without preamble, "where's your husband?" "Gone to town for supplies," Rebecca lied smoothly. "We were running low on flour and sugar in this rain. The rain started after he left. He'll be back when he gets back." Cord studied her for a long moment, then gestured to his men. "Search the house. Search the barn. Search every inch of this property. If she's here, find her." Rebecca didn't move from the doorway. "Thee has no warrant, no legal authority to search my home. I have all the authority I need," Cord said, his hand resting on his pistol. "Step aside, ma'am, or we'll move you aside." Rebecca considered fighting, considered becoming a martyr for the cause, but something in Cord's eyes told her he'd happily shoot her where she stood, and her death wouldn't save Betsy. So she stepped aside, praying silently that God would protect the innocent and confound the wicked. The men tore through the farmhouse like a tornado. They overturned furniture, ripped up floorboards, emptied every cabinet and trunk. They found the root cellar and searched it thoroughly, but Betsy was long gone. In the barn, they scattered hay and grain, checked every stall and loft. After an hour of fruitless searching, Cord called off the hunt. His face was purple with rage as he confronted Rebecca again. "You're hiding her. I know it. And when I prove it, you'll hang right alongside her. If thee finds proof, then do thy worst," Rebecca replied calmly. "Until then, I'll thank thee to leave my property." The men mounted up and rode away, but Cord left 2 men behind to watch the farm, positioned in the woods where they could observe the house and barn. Rebecca saw them go, and knew Samuel would spot them, too. He was too experienced to lead pursuers directly to the next station. On the muddy road heading north, Samuel Henderson drove his wagon with the patience of a man who'd done this before. He could feel Betsy shifting slightly beneath the hay, could hear her muffled breathing. Every minute that passed took them further from danger, but they had miles to go. Yet the rain continued, a mixed blessing. It hid their tracks but made travel slow and treacherous. The wagon wheels bogged down repeatedly in the mud, requiring Samuel to climb down and push while the horse strained. During one such stop, Samuel spoke quietly toward the hay. "Stay still. We're being followed." Behind them, perhaps a quarter-mile back, 3 riders were barely visible through the rain and trees. They made no attempt to close the distance, content to simply follow and see where the wagon led. Samuel considered his options. He couldn't lead them to the next station. That would compromise the entire network in this region. He couldn't outrun them. The wagon was too heavy and slow. That left only one choice. He checked his weapons and drove on, waiting for the right place. The road entered a stretch of dense forest, with trees pressing close on both sides. Here, Samuel stopped the wagon completely and climbed down, rifle in hand. "Stay hidden," he told Betsy. "No matter what happens, stay hidden and keep quiet." Then he positioned himself behind the wagon and waited. The 3 riders emerged from the rain like ghosts, their faces uncertain when they saw Samuel standing in the road. "That's far enough," Samuel called out. "State thy business or turn back." The lead rider, a young man with a wispy beard, called back. "We're following orders. Tracking a runaway slave. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "I know thee has no right to follow me on a public road." "We got every right. Now step aside and let us search your wagon." "I will not." The 3 men exchanged glances. They could see the rifle in Samuel's hands, could see the determination in his stance. The question was whether they were willing to die for the cause of returning one slave to bondage. The young man made his decision. His hand dropped to his pistol. Samuel fired first. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder, and the young man toppled from his horse with a scream, clutching his shoulder. His 2 companions froze, their own weapons half drawn. The next shot goes through his heart. Samuel said calmly, reloading with practiced efficiency, "Then I'll kill thy horses so they can't follow. Then thee can decide if thee wants to die in these woods over this." The wounded man moaned, blood seeping between his fingers. His companions looked at each other, at Samuel, at the rifle now pointed steadily at them. Whatever courage had brought them this far evaporated in the face of a Quaker willing to commit violence for his principles. "We're leaving," one of them said, dismounting to help his wounded friend back onto a horse. "But this isn't over." "It never is," Samuel replied. They rode away, the wounded man slumped in his saddle. Samuel waited until they were out of sight, then quickly unhitched his horse and set the wagon rolling backward off the road, where it tilted and settled into a muddy ditch. He pulled the hay away to reveal Betsy, her eyes wide with terror and something like awe. "Can thee ride?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Good. We'll ride double to the next station. It's faster, and they'll be looking for a wagon, not 2 people on horseback. Come." He pulled her up behind him, and they rode into the rain, leaving the road and cutting through the forest where tracks would be harder to follow. Betsy clung to Samuel's back, her mind reeling. She'd killed a man, and now a stranger had shot another man to protect her. The weight of violence was spreading like ripples in water, touching people she'd never met, changing lives she'd never know. But she couldn't afford to dwell on that now. Survival was the only goal that mattered. Survival and the distant dream of freedom that grew more real with every mile. The next station on the Underground Railroad was a small cabin built into the side of a hill, so well hidden by vegetation and careful landscaping that someone could ride within 20 feet and never see it. It belonged to a free black family named the Turners, Ezekiel and Martha, who'd bought their freedom 20 years earlier and now dedicated their lives to helping others achieve the same. Samuel and Betsy arrived after dark, both exhausted and soaked through. Martha Turner opened the hidden door before they could knock, having spotted them approaching through the carefully placed observation ports built into the hillside. "Samuel," she said warmly, embracing the old Quaker. "We'd heard rumors thee was comin'. Is this the woman from Rosefield?" "This is Betsy," Samuel confirmed, helping her dismount. "She needs rest, food, and a few days to let the search parties lose interest before moving further north." Martha drew Betsy inside, where warmth and lamplight and the smell of cooking food created an atmosphere so safe, so homely, that Betsy's legs nearly gave out beneath her. It was too much kindness after too much cruelty, too much hope after too much despair. She collapsed into a chair by the fire and wept, great racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her body could contain. Martha knelt beside her, holding her hands, saying nothing, just being present in the grief. Samuel spoke quietly with Ezekiel in the corner, sharing information about the pursuit, about the shooting, about the danger that would surely follow. Ezekiel listened gravely, his weathered face showing no fear, only calculation. "They'll be watching all the main roads now," he said. "We'll need to move her cross-country, through the swamps and backwoods where horses can't follow. It'll take longer, but it's safer." "How long before she can move on?" 3 days minimum. She's exhausted, and the search parties are still too active. After 3 days, we'll have a better idea of where they're concentrating their efforts." Samuel nodded and prepared to leave. But Betsy's voice stopped him. "Why?" she asked, her face still wet with tears. "Why did you risk everything for me? You don't even know me?" Samuel turned back, his gray eyes gentle. "I know enough. I know thee was created in God's image, same as me. I know thee has a soul that cries out for freedom, same as mine would if I were in chains. That's all I need to know." After he left, riding back through the darkness toward his farm and whatever consequences awaited him there, Martha helped Betsy clean up and change into dry clothes. The cabin was small but meticulously organized, every inch of space used efficiently. The Turners had engineered it with care. The main room appeared to be nothing more than a root cellar if discovered, but hidden panels revealed sleeping areas, storage, and even a tunnel that led further into the hillside. "You're safe here," Martha assured her as she served up a bowl of thick stew. "We've hidden dozens of souls in this place over the years, and not one has been caught. The Lord looks after his own." Betsy ate slowly, savoring every bite, real food, warm and seasoned, and given freely. It had been so long since anyone had offered her something without expecting payment in suffering. Over the next 3 days, she began to heal. Not completely, some wounds never fully close, but enough to remember what it felt like to be human rather than property. Martha and Ezekiel treated her with dignity, asked her opinions, listened when she spoke. Small things that meant everything. Ezekiel taught her how to read the stars for navigation, how to identify edible plants, how to move through the forest without leaving obvious tracks. "Knowledge is freedom," he told her. "The more thee knows, the less thee needs to depend on others." Martha shared stories of other runaways who'd passed through, painting a picture of a vast network of brave souls working to undermine the institution of slavery, one person at a time. Some of the stories ended happily with freedom and reunion. Others ended in recapture and punishment. But all of them ended with resistance, with the refusal to accept bondage as a permanent condition. On the evening of the 3rd day, Ezekiel returned from a scouting trip with news. The search for Betsy had intensified rather than diminished. Constable Bradford had been removed from the case. After it became known he'd warned the Hendersons, and Silas Cord had taken over the investigation with single-minded fury. He'd organized a semi-permanent search party, offering rewards for information, interrogating slaves on every plantation within 50 miles. "They're not going to give up," Ezekiel said grimly. "Cord has made this personal. He's telling everyone that if one slave can murder an overseer and escape, it'll encourage rebellion across the whole South." He's right, of course. Every slave who hears your story is thinking about their own freedom. Betsy felt the weight of this settle on her shoulders. She hadn't just killed Harlan. She'd become a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. Her actions had sparked something that could either burn bright or be violently extinguished. "What do we do?" she asked. "We'll get thee to freedom faster than originally planned. Tomorrow night, thee leaves for Tennessee. There's a conductor there, a white man named Thomas Garrett, who specializes in difficult cases. He'll get thee all the way to Canada if necessary." That night, Betsy couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Sarah, the 15-year-old girl who'd hanged herself in the barn. About Dinah, who'd stopped speaking. About her own daughter sold away to Mississippi, who would be 13 now if she was still alive. Would she even recognize Betsy if they passed on the street? She thought about Harlan burning in the smokehouse. Some part of her expected to feel guilt, but she felt nothing. Maybe guilt would come later. Maybe it wouldn't come at all. Maybe that made her a monster. Or maybe it just made her human. Martha found her sitting by the dying fire, staring into the embers. "Can't sleep?" the older woman asked, settling into a chair beside her. "I keep thinking about what happens next. If I make it to freedom, what then? I don't know how to be free. I've been a slave my whole life." Martha smiled sadly. "None of us knows how to be free until we are. But I can tell thee this freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the presence of choice. It's waking up each day and deciding for thyself what thee will do, where thee will go, who thee will be. That's a skill thee will learn, just like thee learned to survive bondage. What if I'm not strong enough? Thee burned thy oppressor alive and walked away. Thee has walked through rain and darkness, trusted strangers, risked everything for a chance at something better. If that's not strong, I don't know what is." The next evening, as the sun set behind the hills, a man arrived at the cabin Thomas Garrett, the conductor Ezekiel had mentioned. He was younger than Betsy expected, maybe 30 years old, with kind eyes and a quiet confidence that reminded her of Samuel Henderson. "Miss Betsy," he said, shaking her hand as if she were a lady rather than a runaway slave. "I've heard about what you did at Rosefield. Took courage, took desperation," Betsy corrected. "Same thing sometimes." He turned to Ezekiel. "What's the latest on the search?" "They've got patrols on all the main roads and checkpoints, at every river crossing. They're offering $500 for her capture, dead or alive. Cord's convinced she's heading for Tennessee." "Then we'll go through Georgia instead," Garrett said calmly. "Longer route, but less expected. I've got contacts in Atlanta who can hide her for a week. Then we'll circle back north through the mountains into Kentucky and eventually Ohio." Betsy's head spun. These were places she'd only heard whispered about. Lands so distant they might as well have been the moon. And yet this man spoke about traveling there, as casually as if they were going to the next county over. They left an hour after full dark, Garrett leading the way on foot, with Betsy close behind. He moved like a ghost through the forest, finding paths where none seemed to exist, reading the landscape in ways that suggested years of experience. They walked for hours, covering ground that horses couldn't traverse, crossing streams to confuse potential tracking dogs. Just before dawn, they reached another safe house. This one a barn owned by a sympathetic farmer who asked no questions and offered no names. Garrett and Betsy slept in the hayloft during the day, then continued their journey the following night. This pattern repeated for a week. Walk by night, sleep by day, always moving, always vigilant. Garrett taught her as they traveled, pointing out landmarks, sharing tricks for survival, treating her like a student rather than cargo. "Why do you do this?" Betsy asked one night as they rested beside a stream. "You're risking your life for strangers." Garrett was quiet for a moment, staring up at the stars. "My mother was a slave," he finally said. "She was freed when I was young, but I remember what it was like. The fear in her eyes, the way she flinched when white men came near. She died free, but she never really escaped the scars of bondage. I do this so other mothers won't have to pass those scars on to their children." They pushed deeper into Georgia, skirting around towns, avoiding main roads. The nights were warm now, spring fully arrived, and the forest was alive with sounds: owls hunting, frogs singing, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. On the 8th night of their journey, they made a mistake. They were crossing through a small town called Hartwell, moving through the outskirts where the houses thinned out and forest began. Garrett had scouted the route earlier and deemed it safe. But somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching. A shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Betsy's ear, so close she felt the heat of it. Garrett grabbed her arm and yanked her into the trees as more shots followed, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like fireflies. "Run," he shouted, pushing her ahead of him. "Run and don't look back." They crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, she could hear men shouting, dogs barking, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Garrett pulled her into a hollow beneath a fallen tree. Both of them pressed tight against the earth, breathing hard. The sound of men crashed past them, dogs straining at leashes. But the pursuers continued on, following the wrong trail. They waited an hour before moving, then 2 hours, until Garrett was confident the immediate danger had passed. When they finally emerged, he looked shaken for the first time since they'd met. "That shouldn't have happened," he muttered. "Someone must have seen us, must have sent word ahead. They're getting organized. Maybe I should turn back," Betsy suggested. "Go to ground somewhere and wait for things to calm down." "There is no going back. There is no calming down. Court has made sure of that. The only way out is through." He studied the stars, recalculating their route. "We need to move faster, take more risks. I'm going to get you to Atlanta within 3 days. Then we'll figure out the next move." They pushed hard over the next 72 hours, sleeping in shifts, eating on the move, covering distances that left Betsy's feet bleeding and her body screaming for rest. But Garrett drove them forward with single-minded determination, knowing that hesitation meant capture, and capture meant death. Atlanta rose before them on the afternoon of the 3rd day. A sprawling city larger than anything Betsy had ever seen, full of noise and movement and danger. Garrett led her through back alleys to a small church on the edge of the city, where a black minister named Reverend Jonas welcomed them into the basement. They made good time, Jonas said, his voice deep and comforting. "We received word thee was coming. There's trouble brewing, though. The authorities have been making inquiries, asking questions about strange travelers. Someone knows the railroad runs through Atlanta." Garrett cursed softly. "How long can you hide her?" "A few days at most. Then we need to move her on or risk compromising the whole network." As they talked logistics, Betsy examined the basement. It was set up as a classroom, with benches and a chalkboard and books stacked on shelves. On the wall hung a map of the United States with pins marking various locations. She studied the map, tracing the distance they'd already traveled and the distance that remained. So far to go still, so many dangers between here and freedom. The impossibility of it threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered the smokehouse, remembered the heat and the smoke and Harlan's screams. She'd already done the impossible once. She could do it again. The basement of Reverend Jonas's church became Betsy's world for the next 5 days. During daylight hours, she remained hidden behind a false wall that Jonas had constructed years ago. A space barely large enough to lie down in, with gaps that allowed air and dim light to filter through. At night, she emerged to eat, stretch, and hear the latest news about the search. The news was not encouraging. Silas Cord had arrived in Atlanta with a dozen men, showing Betsy's description to every constable and patrol officer in the city. He'd convinced the mayor to offer an additional reward, now up to $100,000, for her capture. $1,000 was more money than most working men would see in 5 years. It turned every pair of eyes into potential threats. "He's obsessed," Garrett reported on the third night, returning from his own reconnaissance. "I watched him at the courthouse today. He's not just angry anymore. He's terrified. Word about Rosefield has spread across the South. Slaves are whispering about it, taking courage from it. Overseers are nervous, looking over their shoulders. Cord knows that if you escape, if you make it to freedom, and your story spreads even further, it could inspire others. Inspire more violence? Is that what I've done?" Betsy asked quietly. Inspired violence. Reverend Jonas, who'd been reading his Bible by lamplight, looked up. "Thee has inspired resistance. Violence is what was done to thee for 34 years. What thee did was self-defense. The law doesn't see it that way. The law is written by men who own slaves. Of course it doesn't see it that way." Jonas closed his Bible. "But there's a higher law, sister. A law written in the human heart. And that law says no person has the right to own another, to use them, to break them." Thee answered that higher law. On the fourth night, Thomas Garrett returned with disturbing news. One of the church's deacons, a free black man named Samuel, who'd been part of the Underground Railroad for years, had been arrested. The charges were vague. Vagrancy, suspicion of theft, but everyone knew the real reason. The authorities were squeezing anyone who might have information about Betsy's whereabouts. "They're going to torture him," Garrett said bluntly. "Try to make him talk. Samuel's strong, but everyone breaks eventually." Jonas's face remained calm, but his hands clenched. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 2 days before Samuel can't hold out anymore. We need to move Betsy tonight. Get her out of Atlanta completely." "To where?" "Every route north is being watched." Garrett spread a map on the floor, studying it by lamplight. "We'll go west first." "Toward Alabama?" "Alabama? That's moving back toward Rosefield, back toward danger. We can hide her in Birmingham for a week. Let Cord's men chase false trails heading north. Then we swing up through Tennessee when they're not looking." It was risky, perhaps insane. But Garrett was right about one thing. No one would expect them to double back toward the very place Betsy had fled from. Sometimes the most dangerous move was the safest. That night, under cover of darkness, Betsy left Atlanta dressed as a young man. Garrett had obtained clothes for her: rough work pants, a shirt, a hat pulled low to hide her face. They joined a group of laborers heading west to work on railroad construction. 20 men traveling together for safety against bandits. None of the real workers knew they were harboring a fugitive. Did you know before African slavery became the dominant labor system in the American colonies, Native Americans were extensively enslaved, particularly during the 17th and early 18th centuries. In South Carolina alone, between 24,000 and 51,000 Native Americans were enslaved between 1670 and 1715, exported to plantations in the Caribbean and other colonies. However, This practice declined because Native Americans had higher mortality rates due to European diseases, knew the local terrain well, making escape easier, and their enslavement provoked dangerous wars with neighboring tribes. The transition to African slavery was partly economic. It was considered safer by colonists. Ironically, on some plantations, enslaved Africans and Native Americans formed families together, creating communities of mixed heritage. Their descendants still exist today, though their history has often been erased from mainstream narratives about American slavery. Garrett had simply paid the foreman for 2 spots in the group and kept to himself and Betsy during the journey. They walked during the day now, hiding in plain sight among legitimate travelers, sleeping in camps with the other workers at night. It was exhausting and nerve-wracking. Every time someone looked at Betsy too long, every time a patrol passed on the road, her heart threatened to burst from her chest. But the disguise held. Men saw what they expected to see: another laborer, another poor soul trying to earn a living through hard work. After 5 days of travel, they reached Birmingham, a growing industrial city where the smoke from foundries and factories hung in the air like a permanent fog. Here, Garrett had contacts in the free black community who could hide Betsy more securely. They stayed with a family named the Washingtons, George and Clara, who lived in a small house on the edge of the Black Quarter. George worked at a foundry, coming home each night covered in soot and exhausted, but he greeted Betsy with warmth and respect. "Your story has reached even here," he told her over dinner the first night. "Folks are talking about the woman who burned the overseer. Some say you're a hero. Some say you're crazy. But everyone agrees you're brave." "I don't feel brave," Betsy admitted. "I feel terrified every moment of every day." Clara reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Bravery ain't the absence of fear, child. It's acting despite the fear. And you've been doing that since the night you locked that door." Over the next week, Betsy slowly began to believe she might actually survive. The routine of hiding during the day and emerging at night became familiar. The Washingtons treated her like family, sharing their food and their home without complaint. George brought news from the foundry about troop movements and patrol patterns. Clara taught her more about reading and writing, skills that would serve her well in freedom. But on the 8th day, everything went wrong. George came home early from the foundry, his face pale beneath the suit. "There's talk at work. Someone's been asking questions about strangers in the neighborhood. Specifically about a woman matching your description. They're going door to door." Garrett, who'd been staying in a nearby boarding house to avoid drawing attention to the Washingtons, arrived within the hour. "We need to move now. I've arranged transport to Tennessee, but we have to leave tonight." The transport turned out to be a freight wagon carrying cotton bales to Chattanooga. The driver, a white man named McCullough, had been smuggling runaways for years, hiding them in specially constructed compartments within the load. "It's not comfortable," he warned as he showed Betsy the hiding spot, a hollow space between cotton bales, barely large enough for a person to fit. "You'll be in there for 2 days, maybe 3. We'll stop twice a day to let you out for food and necessities. But the rest of the time you need to stay hidden and quiet. If we get inspected at a checkpoint, they'll be stabbing bayonets into the load. You'll need to stay perfectly still no matter what." Betsy climbed into the space, feeling the walls of cotton close around her. It was suffocating, claustrophobic, like being buried alive. But it was also safety, anonymity, a chance to slip past the patrols that were growing tighter by the day. McCullough and Garrett secured the compartment, stacking additional bales to hide the entrance. Then the wagon rolled out of Birmingham, heading northeast toward Tennessee and the promise of safer territory. Those 3 days were the longest of Betsy's life. The darkness was complete, the air thick and hard to breathe. She could hear everything happening outside. McCullough talking to other travelers on the road, the rattle of wheels over rough ground, the occasional bark of patrol officers checking papers at checkpoints. Twice, just as McCullough had warned, bayonets stabbed into the cotton load. Betsy pressed herself into the smallest possible space, feeling the blades whisper past her body, missing her by inches. She didn't scream, didn't move, barely breathed. The soldiers outside, satisfied they'd checked thoroughly, waved the wagon through. When McCullough finally opened the compartment on the 3rd day, Betsy tumbled out, gasping for air, her limbs cramped and her mind spinning. They were in a forest clearing somewhere in Tennessee, the air cooler here in the mountains, pine trees stretching toward a brilliant blue sky. "You made it," McCullough said, offering her water. "The worst is behind you now. From here, it's mostly friendly territory until you reach the Ohio River. Cross that, and you're in free states." Garrett helped her to her feet, studying her with concern. The journey had taken its toll. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her clothes hung loose, dark circles shadowed her eyes. But she was still standing, still moving forward. "How much further?" she asked. 2 weeks to the Ohio River, if we move carefully. Then another few days to reach contacts in Cincinnati who can help you establish yourself. A month, maybe, until you're truly safe. A month. After everything she'd endured, a month seemed both impossibly long and remarkably short. But Betsy nodded, accepting the timeline. She'd come this far. She wouldn't give up now. They traveled through Tennessee's mountains, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the pursuit that continued to dog them. The network of abolitionists was stronger here, more organized, and Betsy began to see the true scope of the Underground Railroad. Hundreds of people, black and white, risking everything to fight slavery, one person at a time. She met conductors and station masters hiding in root cellars and false bottom wagons, eating whatever food could be spared. She heard stories of other runaways, some successful, others tragic. She learned that the railroad had been operating for decades, that thousands had made this journey before her, that thousands more would follow. In a small town called Sweetwater, they stayed with an elderly white woman named Abigail Morse, who'd been hiding runaways since before Betsy was born. Abigail was tiny and fierce, with white hair and eyes that missed nothing. "I was at Seneca Falls," she told Betsy one evening as they sat by the fire, "back in '48, when we declared that women deserve the same rights as men. And I realized then that if we're going to fight for our own freedom, we have to fight for everyone's freedom. Can't have it both ways. Were you afraid?" Betsy asked. "Starting this work, knowing the danger." Abigail smiled. "Terrified. Still am every time someone knocks on the door. But fear is just a feeling, child. It doesn't have to control you. You of all people should understand that." They pushed on through Knoxville, through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, where the laws were still hostile, but the sympathy of many residents ran toward freedom. Winter was approaching now, the air turning cold, leaves falling from the trees in drifts of red and gold. Finally, on a gray morning in late October, they crested a hill, and Garrett pointed into the distance. "There," he said simply, "the Ohio River." Betsy stared at the wide ribbon of water cutting through the landscape. On the other side lay free states. Ohio, where slavery was illegal, where she would no longer be property, but a person with rights and protections under the law. She'd traveled over 500 miles since leaving Rosefield. She'd been hunted, shot at, nearly caught a dozen times. She'd relied on the kindness of strangers and the courage of conductors who risked everything for her freedom. And now freedom itself was just a river crossing away. They waited until full dark, then approached a ferry run by a Quaker family who asked no questions. The crossing took less than 30 minutes, but to Betsy, it felt like an eternity. She stood at the railing, watching Alabama and Georgia, and all the pain of her past life recede behind her, while Ohio and possibility grew larger ahead. When the ferry docked on the northern shore, when her feet touched free soil for the first time in her life, Betsy fell to her knees and wept. Not from sadness now, but from overwhelming, impossible relief. She was free. She was actually truly free. Garrett knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Welcome to Ohio, Miss Betsy. Welcome to your new life." Cincinnati was a city of contradictions. Though Ohio was a free state, it sat directly across the river from Kentucky, a slave state, and the laws protecting free black people were complex and often ignored. Slave catchers still operated here. Technically illegal, but tolerated by authorities, who feared angering their southern neighbors. Garrett took Betsy to a boarding house run by a free black family named the Douglases. No relation to the famous Frederick Douglass, but admirers of his work. The boarding house catered specifically to former slaves adjusting to freedom, providing not just shelter but education, job training, and community. "This is where you'll rebuild your life," Garrett told her as they stood on the front porch of the three-story building. Catherine Douglas runs a school for adults, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic. She also has contacts throughout the city who employ former slaves in legitimate jobs. "You'll be safe here." Betsy gripped his arm, suddenly afraid of his leaving. Over the past 2 months, Garrett had become her guide, her protector, her connection to this strange new world. The thought of navigating it without him was terrifying. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You thank me by living," Garrett replied simply, "by being free and happy and never letting them make you small again. That's all the thanks any of us need." He pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch. "There's $50 in there. It's not much, but it's enough to get you started. Catherine will help you find work." Then he was gone, disappearing into the Cincinnati streets, to guide the next person toward freedom, to risk his life again and again, because some battles were too important to abandon. Catherine Douglas was a remarkable woman, educated, articulate, with an iron will wrapped in kindness. She welcomed Betsy into the boarding house and immediately set about assessing her needs. "Can you read?" she asked during their first conversation. "A little. Clara Washington in Birmingham taught me some." "Good. We'll build on that. Can you do arithmetic? Basic counting?" "Never had reason to learn more. You'll learn now. Education is power, Betsy. It's the difference between working for pennies and working for dollars. It's the difference between being dependent on others and being independent." Over the next weeks, Betsy threw herself into learning with desperate intensity. She attended Catherine's classes every evening, practicing letters and numbers until her hand cramped. During the day, she worked at a laundry service owned by another former slave, earning her first wages as a free woman, 25 cents a day, which seemed like a fortune after a lifetime of unpaid labor. The work was hard, the hours long, but it was her work, her choice, her decision that made all the difference. She made friends at the boarding house, other women who'd made similar journeys, who understood the weight of memory and the difficulty of building a new life. They shared stories late into the night, processing their trauma together, finding strength in community. One woman, Harriet, had escaped from Maryland 10 years earlier and now worked as a seamstress, saving money to buy her children's freedom. Another, Susan, had been freed by her master's will upon his death and was learning to be a teacher. They were survivors all, carrying scars but refusing to be defined by them. But even in freedom, Betsy couldn't fully escape her past. 2 months after arriving in Cincinnati, she was walking to work when she saw a notice posted on a wall. A reward poster with a sketch of her face and a description of her crimes. The voters Nalsen for her capture. Dead or alive, Silas Cord hadn't given up. Even here, even across the river in free territory, he was still hunting her. Catherine advised caution. The law technically protects you here, but it's not always enforced. There are men who make their living catching runaways and dragging them back south, using forged papers and corrupt judges. You need to be careful. Betsy began varying her routes to work, staying alert for anyone following her, sleeping lightly with a weapon nearby. The boarding house had protocols for this: safe rooms, escape routes, code words that would alert everyone to danger. For months, nothing happened. Life settled into a routine of work and study and slow healing. Betsy learned to read well enough to understand newspapers. She learned arithmetic well enough to manage her own money. She started saving, depositing coins in an account at a bank that catered to black customers. Spring came, then summer. The anniversary of the night she'd killed Harlan passed unremarked except in her own mind. She didn't regret it. She couldn't regret it. But she thought about it sometimes, wondered if there had been another way, wondered what kind of person she'd become in the fire of that night. Then, on a humid August evening, everything changed again. Betsy was walking home from work when a man stepped out of an alley ahead of her. He was tall and thin, with a pockmarked face and cold eyes. Behind her, she heard footsteps and turned to see 2 more men blocking her retreat. Betsy Johnson, the first man said, her name sounding like a curse. You're coming with us. We got papers that say you're a runaway slave, property of Richard Thornton of Alabama, and we got authorization to bring you back. He held up documents that looked official, even from a distance. Betsy knew they could be forged. Slave catchers were notorious for fabricating paperwork. But that wouldn't matter if she was already in their custody, already being transported south before anyone could verify the documents. I'm a free woman, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I have witnesses who can testify to that. You have no right to touch me. We got every right, the man replied, stepping closer. Now you can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Makes no difference to us either way. Betsy's mind raced. She could run, but there were 3 of them and only one of her. She could scream, but on this quiet street, who would come? She could fight, but fighting would give them an excuse to use violence, maybe kill her, and claim she was resisting. Before she could decide, a voice rang out from behind the slave catchers. Step away from that woman. Everyone turned. Catherine Douglas stood at the mouth of the alley, flanked by 6 men, former slaves and free black citizens, all of them armed with clubs and knives. Behind them, more people were emerging from houses, drawn by some silent alarm that ran through the black community, when danger threatened one of their own. The lead slave catcher's confidence wavered as he realized he was suddenly outnumbered 3-1. His hand dropped to his pistol, but Catherine's voice stopped him. You draw that weapon, and it'll be the last thing you ever do. There are witnesses watching from every window on this street. You try to take this woman, and you'll have to go through all of us. Question is whether $1,000 is worth dying for. The standoff lasted 10 seconds, though it felt like an hour. Finally, the slave catchers backed away, their leader spitting in the dirt. This ain't over, he growled. We'll be back with the law. Then we'll be waiting with lawyers, Catherine replied coolly. Ohio doesn't take kindly to kidnappers, no matter what fraudulent papers you're carrying. The men retreated, and Betsy found herself surrounded by community, by people who barely knew her, but had risked themselves to protect her anyway. This was freedom too, she realized. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of solidarity, of people willing to stand up for each other. That night, Catherine called a meeting at the boarding house. 20 people crowded into the common room, residents, neighbors, activists from the abolitionist movement. Betsy's in danger, Catherine said bluntly. And as long as Silas Cord is hunting her, she'll never be completely safe. We need to get her further north, to Canada, where American slave catchers have no jurisdiction. Betsy shook her head. I won't run again. I'm tired of running. This is my home now. These are my people. I won't abandon that because one angry man can't let go. It's not about letting go, interjected a white man named James, who worked with the Anti-Slavery Society. It's about making an example. Cord believes that if you escape completely, if your story spreads without consequences, it'll inspire others to resist. He's probably right. You've already become a legend in slave communities across the South. Betsy, who burned the overseer, they're singing songs about you. This was news to Betsy. She'd been so focused on survival, she hadn't considered how her actions might reverberate beyond her own life. The thought was overwhelming and humbling. Then what do I do? She asked. I can't hide forever. I can't live in fear forever. No, Catherine agreed. But you can be smart. We'll get you better papers, legal documents proving your free status that even the most corrupt judge would have trouble disputing. We'll teach you to defend yourself, so you're not helpless if they come again. And we'll make sure you're never alone, that there are always people watching out for you. Over the next months, this is exactly what happened. The black community of Cincinnati rallied around Betsy, making her protection a collective responsibility. She received training in self-defense from a former sailor who'd learned to fight in ports around the world. She got legal documents from an abolitionist lawyer who specialized in freedom papers. And slowly, she began to truly believe in her own freedom. Not just freedom from slavery, but freedom to be whoever she wanted to be, to dream bigger than survival. She continued her education, advancing quickly. Catherine suggested she might become a teacher herself, helping other former slaves learn to read and write. The idea felt impossibly large at first, but as the months passed, it began to seem achievable. 2 years after arriving in Cincinnati, Betsy stood before her first class. 6 adults, all former slaves, all struggling with letters and numbers. She taught them patiently, remembering her own frustration when learning, sharing the joy of watching comprehension dawn in their eyes. This was her vengeance, she realized. Not fire and death, but knowledge and empowerment. Every person she taught to read was an act of rebellion against the system that had tried to keep her ignorant. Every person who learned to count money was someone who couldn't be easily cheated. Every freed mind was a defeat for slavery itself. News from the South continued to trickle north. Richard Thornton's plantation had struggled after Harlan's death. Overseers were harder to hire now, and slaves grew bolder in their resistance. Some plantations nearby had experienced accidents. In their smokehouses, fires started by unknown hands. The connection to Betsy's story was never proven, but widely assumed. Silas Cord, obsessed and bankrupted by his unsuccessful search, had died of a heart attack at age 52, still clutching reward posters with Betsy's face. Some said it was justice, some said it was mercy. Betsy felt neither satisfaction nor pity at the news. He'd been a man driven by fear disguised as righteousness, unable to see the humanity of those he considered property. His death changed nothing for the thousands still in bondage. But every day, in small ways, the work of resistance continued. The Underground Railroad kept running. Teachers like Betsy kept educating. Activists kept pressuring for change. And somewhere in the South, women trapped in smokehouses and cotton fields and big houses heard whispers of a woman who'd fought back and survived. Hope is a stubborn thing. It grows in the cracks of oppression, spreads like fire, refuses to be extinguished. On a spring morning in 1844, 2 years to the day after she'd locked Harlan in the smokehouse, Betsy stood on the banks of the Ohio River and looked back toward Alabama. She thought about Sarah and Dinah and all the women whose names she didn't know. She thought about her daughter, sold away, who might be a free woman herself by now or might still be in chains. She made a promise to the wind and water and memory. She would keep teaching, keep resisting, keep being a living testament that slavery could be fought, could be survived, could be defeated one person at a time. Her chains had been silence, her fire had been truth, and her name, Betsy, would be remembered long after the plantation owners and slave catchers had turned to dust. The smoke from Rosefield had risen straight into heaven, carrying with it the scent of justice and freedom intertwined. And in cities and towns, and hidden clearings across America, people breathed that smoke and understood its message. Some battles are won not with violence, but with survival. Some victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from refusing to let them destroy you. Betsy had done both. She had survived, she had resisted, she had become free. And that was the most dangerous thing a slave could ever do,